All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final Day 2 Coalition Interoperability Forum workshop. As a reminder, we are taking audience questions as time permits. So either you can ask your question from your seat. We do have a microphone in the back if you would like to use that as well. Note that this session has been pre-approved for continuing education credits to support several cybersecurity certifications. For full details, you can consult the event app or website. To receive attendance documentation, please have your badge scanned at one of the iPads there in the back of the room at the end of the session. So our speakers this afternoon will be Roger Westman, Principal Cybersecurity Engineer at MITRE, and coming to the stage next, Ian Stewart, Icam Technical Director at NSA. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Stewart here to the stage.
All right, hello everyone. I'm not a major player in this community. I am an Intel community member. I chair the Pti working group. I mean, we do more than PKI. It's all about identity, entity types, credentialing, PKI, and so forth. And I also have a long background with supporting our Five Eyes partners for all things Icam. I mean, we have working groups that we've participated in with our partners for at least 18, 19 years now, and it's an ongoing thing. It never stops. So I do know what it is to do Icam within a large environment and in federation with other partners, not just my second-party partners, but the intelligence community, which at times seems like more of a foreign partnership than our foreign partners do. You'd have to be in the Intel community maybe to understand that. Okay, so today really I'm here to just talk to you about some of the, I think the principal factors that go into what you're going to do when it comes to Icam. You know, I can just speak for NSA that we have done a migration over the last 20 years from old methodology where everything was at the application, you know, probably accounts at every single one managed as they do it, to how we do it now, which is pretty much very dynamic, how you get access to applications using enterprise services. So I am not going to bore everyone with this Icam diagram, but I do believe in this diagram because it does cover the actual factors of Icam, but most importantly, it covers governance and federation, okay? Because if you work alone in one isolated environment, yeah, maybe you don't have to think so much about that. But that is not true for me, and it's not true for the coalition interoperability. You're going to be federating with partners, so you have to really embrace the principles of federation and the governance that must be in place to go around that. Out of curiosity, this screen down here isn't tracking with me, and so I don't really see my slides so well from where I stand. Yeah, so I did cover those statements, so it's just as I said. Okay, there we go. So federation and governance, it's not only whether you work with your partners evenly and have to bring several things together. You may have one partner, and I apologize if there's those in the audience if I tend to sound US-centric today. Sometimes discussing the principles means you can kind of come across being centric towards, well, your own. And I don't mean it, it just happens, it may just happen in discussion. Because sometimes one party may be dictating a standard that all agree to follow, but it still means you have to follow the same principles of federation and the governance that goes with it. All right, so yeah, you may have your environment, you may have your partners and their environments, but you still have to kind of step back to start and consider, can I do centralization of any functions, or can I consider, or must consider federation? Centralization can be easy because you can manage one thing, and everyone conforms to the standards and the methodologies that go with that one thing. And it works where you have maybe a synchronous IT environment and you have a bunch of parties that align with that. Their culture can accept that. But more often than not, in these kinds of partnerships, you're going to have to really subscribe to federation because you're going to have multiple IT domains in play, and you're going to have human cultures that aren't willing to accept doing any kind of centralization of function. I don't know if any of you were at the DOTIS Worldwide Conference in August, but there was a constant theme regarding the intelligence community and our information environment. Our progression of what we have called eyesight. Phase 1 was big attempt to do centralization, and that came and went, and now let there be federation. They tried, and it didn't necessarily work out so well, with the exception of some services. So with federation, you do have to work harder with your partners to identify the standards in play and how you're going to work together to achieve those standards and everything that comes with them. So federation. Over the last year or two, that term has really come to bother me because it seems to be used for a lot of things. And then to add to it, I see NIST 800-63-3C is about federation, but it's not federation in any way that I had previously used it. I use federation when it comes to partnerships, where we have to identify a common thing and work together to do that thing. In Icam, I federate with regards to identity, PKI trusts, even authenticators. You can argue whether that's agreement or federation. Attribute federations, because if you're going to do Icam, that means you're going to do attribute-based access control, which means you have to get a handle on attributes and in partnership with all your partners. And something a little newer is secure token services and the fact that you may be federating that kind of service with partners. So federated identity, that comes into play whenever your identity transcends your IT domain and your identity may cross into other domains. I think of it this way. When I log into my desktop account, I launch my browser. Where can I go with my browser? I'm NSA on NSA Net on my top secret SCI environment. Do I stay in NSA Net? No. My browser can go across JWICs to other Intel communities. I can go to even my second-party partner networks. So my identity goes with me there, and it needs to be federated. It needs to be completely unique amongst the entire partnership there. And before that's ever accomplished, you have to identify what that unique identity is actually going to be and understand that your partners may have their own forms of name, but you just have to identify with each partner what your name forms are and definitely normalize to them. And guess what? They better remain static unless you have a governed plan for change. We in the IC have actually seen some of that with our partners with a large-scale name change plan, but that needs to be definitely governed and managed well to prevent users from losing access. So Federated Pti, where you have partners that all have sovereignty and they determine, I'm not going to use your PKI, I have my own. You've just determined that you have a federation of PKI trusts. Even in the Intel community, just among the US IC, we have typically maintained a federation because Intel agencies have traditionally maintained their own PKIs within the hierarchy of IC PKI, so there's numerous trusts to maintain. But we expand that with our second-party partners. And for me as an NSAer, I not only have my second-party SIGINT partnerships, we have Five Eyes Enterprise, which brings other organizations into play. We even have to deal with the trusts for defense organizations that are part of our Five Eyes enterprise. And if they bring trusts into play, we have to manage that. So to do Federated PTI means you have to work with your partners. You have to identify a common standard. I'm not going to bore you guys with the details of a certificate policy today, unless you really want it. Who's ready for a nap? But there's a number of principles to be found in a certificate policy, and if you're going to federate PTI with your partners, you're all going to have to agree to some notion, whether it's virtual or real, of a certificate policy that kind of is overarching across all of yours. Everyone needs to subscribe to, whether or not they actually write a CP of their own. Yeah, it's a little hard to read that. So all the factors that go into a CP, you have to take account of to be sure that everyone is in the partnership is operating at the same, I just call it assurance levels for things, be it identity proofing, the algorithms, the key management and generation and so forth. All those factors that go into it, you got to all be at the same kind of level. Because if you have one partner operating at a lower assurance level, it drops the assurance of the entirety, because you're all doing a federation of trusts, and you're only as good as the lowest trust that you have in the entire partnership. So everyone has to agree to and abide by a baseline level of assurance for PKI. We are not a big fan of cross-certification, simply for the reason that with cross-certificates, the friend of your friend is also my friend, but maybe I didn't want that friend in my federation. So we're not a big fan of that. We've had some second-party partners that would do cross-certificates, but we in the U.S. Intel community have never engaged in cross-certification. Of course, with PKI, your applications need to do processing of certificates, which means validation of certificates, and that means trust checks and revocation status checks. It's hard enough within one singular IT domain. I think anyone who does PKI knows that the moment you actually expand beyond your own IT domain to other sovereign domains and PKI federations, it can get really hard. How do you do CRLs or OCSP and so forth? That can actually become a nightmare. I would actually, if people are more curious about that, if anyone listens to the Security Now podcast, last week's podcast titled Credential Delegation, the last half hour of that podcast really, Steve Gibson does a great coverage of the history of certificate revocation status checking and its problems. All right, so identity. Again, they can take numerous forms. A key factor is that you need to achieve uniqueness across the entirety of a federation. At NSA, I have a UID, but it's 7 characters. It follows the name form that NSA does. That has no guarantee of uniqueness among the entirety of the partners that I federate with. There could be collisions at that level. So in the US IC, our digital identifiers identified as the distinguished name. Other environments may use other things like an EDI, PI, or such. What matters here is that you have to have uniqueness everywhere where that identity goes. It's paramount. So I also want to be sure that everyone understands that when it comes to PKI, even if at some point in some future you are no longer doing client authentication via a certificate, even though today that's pretty much required on whether you're talking NIPRNet, CIPRNet, and today on the TSSCI fabric, the certificate is specified for client authentication of person entities. Guess what? Even if we do move beyond that at some point, you're going to still need certificates. As long as we have TLS, you're going to need certificates for the servers. And I also challenge people to identify right now a means for if you have a server-to-server TLS session established where client authentication is still required, what would you have that server use if not a certificate right now? They don't have quite as much flexibility as we do because we have all kinds of authenticators hitting the marketplace that could be considered. But something else that has to be made known is that we think there's kind of two kinds of PKI in any one IT domain. There is the ones that we know, the big enterprise PKIs that are user-facing, that are server-facing, that are used for your general TLS across the network when it comes to accessing resources and so forth. But wherever you have an Active Directory, you're very likely going to also have, of course, an Active Directory certificate service running, which is internal to that Microsoft environment. I wrestle with that one right now, not that I think it's a bad idea, but because on the secret fabric, I don't know how those PKIs really work against or with CNSSD 506. Would those be considered to be an only locally trusted PKI, and therefore you have to get a waiver and go through a whole process with the NSS PKI MGB? I don't know. I'll let you all handle that. You also may have a system of VoIP phones that have a certificate infrastructure unto themselves. And I'd argue that, leave that alone. I don't play in that space. So now, authenticators. I kind of want to say authenticators are agreements because you each bring your own authenticator. But when it comes to certificates as an authenticator, well, that goes back to the PKI Federation. So you can argue that still authenticator based on that credential is part of a federation. But you really have to establish in a partnership authenticator agreements as well. Remember, for me, it's all about resource application as part of data access. And I can't have surprise at my applications. They just can't accept any authenticator. You have to have known authenticators. Usually they're configured toward a specific means of authentication. Okay, and that's in a direct authentication, direct client to server kind of authentication model, where you really can't have surprise. Let's see. When you start to have partners and they come into this partnership, they may have their own authenticators already, and you may be in a mode where you don't have standards applied. That's where you're going to have governance to definitely wrestle that one down, because you just can't run any authenticator in a federated environment unless you add other factors to that. Again, today, a lot of authentication occurs from client direct to server. If you start to bring in what we call indirect authentication, where you're starting to bring in identity providers, for instance, as part of OpenID Connect, then you may grow greater flexibility. Even that will require governance, because you're going to have to, everyone's going to have to still have the same assurance level of authenticator, and you probably still need to have a knownness of the authenticators being presented, even in the case of an identity provider, because your identity provider may not be configured to expect anything coming to it. It's probably going to be very established, configured, what kind of authenticators are being presented to it. If you're in an authentication environment where you're enabling multiple kinds of authenticators. Again, today we all have certificates, and they are still a very convenient kind of credential to use for authentication, because they have they convey the identity, your federated identity within them, and we all have them today. So that is kind of convenient. The applications may not like them so well for direct authentication, but we do have them today, and we have a lot of policy in place saying that's what you're going to use. But again, as I stated before, with authenticators, you're only as good as the weakest one allowed in an entire federation, so you're going to have to work governance to identify standards with your partners. So, attributes. If you're going to talk Icam, you're going to have to talk about attribute-based access control, right? And that means you've got to talk attributes. Now, you may be doing ABAC in your own environment. Your partners may or may not be doing ABAC in their environment. But what you're going to have to do is agree on attribute standards. I know in my environment we refer to them as attribute specifications, where you identify a common set of attributes and the metadata associated with them. That way everyone can operate on the same kind of plane where we know what an attribute means here and we know what it means there. Whether it's mapped locally internally in any one partner IT domain, that may be up to them, but as long as we can talk the same attribute language, that's vitally important for ABAC in a federation. Okay, so I briefly mentioned secure token service. I'm not going to be talking at length about that. I know in the US Intel community and with my second party partners, we are only just now starting to breach that kind of service capability. We have not really kicked it off, but we do see the great utility in it because one, I won't necessarily force my applications to directly process client certificates. They can operate through an identity provider, for instance, and start to tokenize operations, which many applications out there, particularly open source stuff, understands far better for client authentication than they do presentation of a certificate. I mean, how much client certificate-based authentication happens on the real internet? Any? I'm not aware of it. But then, even with STS, when you start talking federations, you're going to have to work with your partners. What does an STS? You may have an STS federation, or your partners may just think, hey, I've issued my user an ephemeral token from my STS, and they're going to cross the boundary into my IT domain with that token and authenticate. Well, maybe not. If you've not identified standards of operations with your partners, that is never going to work. So these, even with STS, you really have to work with your federation partners to identify the ground rules, the rules of engagement with STS. How are you going to operate? Are they going to federate with each other, or are you going to do some other model of tokenization in your federation? That really has to be worked out if you want to have success with that. But I do see a transition to that kind of model using STSs over time. It's going to take time. Speaking just for NSA, we're a victim of our own success with such robust PKI-enabled applications in our environment, meaning client authenticated, which means we've got all that done. You can't just turn on a dime and change to another paradigm for authentication with those applications. It's going to take time. I just wanted to briefly throw in here the basic models that come with 863-3C. You may read about the front channel and the back channel methods. I'm not going to belabor this. I just want to point out that one, the front channel is based on I'll just say the user being redirected from the application to the identity provider where they get a token. They are directly given a token, a claim, an assertion, call it what you will, that they then go back and provide directly to the application, whereas the back channel model, while the user is again redirected as before, they are only given maybe a reference code that they then provide back to the application, which then does an interaction with the identity provider whereby a token is issued in the back end. I'm not going to belabor that because, Roger, I think you might be talking more about that. I'm not sure. Not in this presentation. Yeah, we think that there's a trend that's going to be leaning more on back channel over time. Okay, so, as you can see, I'm not going deep into how do you implement all these things today, what should a coalition environment do necessarily at the deep technical level. I just want to point out that this is hard stuff, and you're not going to want to try to do every bit of Icam all at once. You're going to have to prioritize, figure out what is the most common sense way to move forward. And that's why at this morning's session, I kind of talked about PKI some, because that's something you know you need, and it might be one of the easier ones to get started on. Some of these other parts of Icam maybe will take a little more work. I didn't talk about data management and labeling, because if you really want to do the best you can with Icam, go as far as it can go, data centricity, you're going to need to manage and label data, and that's going to require, again, working with partners to make sure you have common standards of interaction with each other and data. So I said a moment ago, yeah, you're going to have to prioritize what you want to do with Icam, what order of battle you want to do, what do you want to bite off sooner or later. And I can't say enough, if you're going to do these things, get working with your partners immediately. Set up those working groups, call them what you will. You've got to establish some standards with them and implement them if you wish to get moving with Icam. This is not something I've had to do, because I don't have the unexpected partners based on some event in the world. But if nothing else, you may have to have some cheat sheet or rules of engagement where if you're going to have a new partner, these are the kinds of things you're going to need to do to get started faster with these partners. If you know what you need to do with them, and it may be a scale of things, because not all partners have the same capability as others, you're going to still have to have a series of cheat sheets that might apply to different kinds of partners. I would suggest getting that sort of business done sooner than later, because you don't want to be guessing at the time of need with a new partner based on some event, because that's going to make it really hard to do. And stick to the standards, okay? Everything that we do here is all standards based. Don't deviate from that. And sustain that partner interaction. Like I said, myself with my partners, we've been working together for 18, 19 years or more, and things keep changing, things keep evolving. We keep working with our partners. It does not end. I think we're saving questions for later. So I'm going to cede the floor to Roger. Cede. I don't know about you guys, but I was watching some of the impeachment inquiry today, so I'm ceding time to Roger.
I thought you were talking about RSA seed files. Hang on a second, sorry. My camera came on for some reason on my Android phone. Maybe it's that malware they were just talking about. Plus, it's a new phone, and I don't know how to use it. Friday night before you're leaving, your old phone dies, you get a new phone, you're trying to move everything over, and you hope it works. So my name's Roger Westman. I'm with the MITRE Corporation. I've been supporting the community and the department and other activities for a long time. And we'll talk a little about some of the journey and tie it in with Ian's presentation. Just to give a perspective, we have been on this journey a good while, and we went from a network point of view to a resource-centric point of view, where all these resources came in, these applications, and at one time, after I would log into my desktop, I still had at least 10 different user ID and passwords, and we've all been through that. So our initial focus was stop that insanity. And as Ian said, we went to PKI certificates to give a single sign-on experience within our local environment, but across the entire operational fabric. And then, as we were doing that, we knew we were going to explicitly tag the data, which now people are calling data centricity. And so we'll talk a few minutes about this. Let's see. Slide Ian had basically 19th and 20th century technologies and thoughts. We're in the 21st century now, where we're trying to be very explicit on how we tag people, we tag data, and actually know what your access control rules are Not like in the old days when you store it and they say, well, go see Bob down the hall and he'll let you know if he'll add him. You can see that file that is super secret. Bob doesn't own the file, the enterprise owns the file. So we're just trying to codify that and then move to more modern standards and everything. I already talked about that. So one thing, and I harped on it earlier today, and I'm going to harp on it again. If you don't know your access rules, and when I say access, it's your disclosure rules, it's your business logic, whatever phrase that works for you, then you're going to be out of luck. You have to know in all possible conditions, and this is not complete by any stretch of the imagination, but for my closed environment on the high side, we didn't have certain problems. I don't have cars calling in and, the director going to Starbucks at this moment in time, accessing data off the high side. He or she might down the road, but at this moment in time, I don't have that problem. We have settled on a specific credential. We know that will change. Certain people say smart cards are bad. The form factor may be nowadays. You go to some other form factor, it still may give you the same capability. It may not. Anywhere in the world you have to access. Problem with anywhere, I don't know what that means. When I have people connect in via VPNs and I logged into one VDI, which logged into my other VDI, which logged into my other VDI, I don't know where that person is. And you can't do it via IP addresses because people lie. And of course, any situation from peacetime to under stress. Humanitarian things. About 3 years ago, we were down in New Zealand when they had their major earthquake, so it was nice seeing a Navy ship over the horizon in case we needed it. And of course, under any threat conditions. But not saying you have to write every possible out, but at least write the ones you know. And as we said earlier, we're moving from dynamic ABAC, I didn't go back in time, to the network and resource centric, where we know we have attributes about people, pull those attributes from various sources, and I'll give an example in a second. When we tag the data, be very explicit because you want to dynamically ingest that information. Doesn't mean that everybody has to follow the exact same specification for tagging the data. The intelligence community uses the trusted dated format, which is out on the internet as a reference standard. But if your partners are using their data tagging standard, when the data transitions from their control to your control, you have to be able to translate and convert, obviously. But you also have to keep provenance in check, or provenance with that information, so you know who originally collected that information and is responsible for it. And then, of course, if you commingle the data because you wrote a joint report, who owns that document all of a sudden? That's a legal thing. Us IT people say, you tell us the answer, we'll help implement it. But it creates problems when you start tagging data explicitly because you're not sure which classification mark should be honored. Or as earlier today, they reminded me, with certain countries, we're very US-centric in this talk, they may not like the classification mark to be in English. They may prefer their native language. So you have to make sure to translate it when it goes over to their area, or they translate it. The problem with email is when you hit back and forth replies, 10 to 15 times, your email is huge with all these classification things in there. And you're hoping that your classify tool has enough, I always say AI, it's the current algorithms that we have in it, is smart enough to make the right decision on what they are. Most of the time they are, but you still have to ask a human at times. As we move up the scale, we're looking for, obviously, more attributes to be explicitly identified. Different people use different names, so I'm not trying to get into a religious war about the names on the chart. But we know we need environment, we need world situation, or whatever makes sense for your environment. We know we want more information about the user. The user can be a carbon-based life form or a silicon-based life form. We don't discriminate in that sense. But we need to understand their behavior, their current operating behavior, their past behavior, a projected future, and of course, normalization against a larger data set. As Ian said, we know PKI was perfect in the past. In other environments, we're going to have to expand out the authenticators. As we discussed earlier today with a humanitarian relief effort, I do not expect Red Cross volunteer to have a CAC card with them at a moment in time. They may be having a user ID and password we give them. They may have a smartphone, a Gmail account, and we're going to have to be able to support that, assuming oversight and compliant actually signs off on the rules. IT people don't make the decisions, IT people help build things. In addition to that, and that leads into the explicit mission security, risk adaptive access control. As I said earlier on the other slide, we have to be adaptive where policy allows us to be. Obviously, for nuclear command and control, we would never say you should launch based on a text you get from the internet. We would want a little more assurance that that is a positive command to do that. But in other environments, the launch menu, maybe you'll let different things occur. That's the reason I say it's an explicit agreement between the mission and the security risk, because they have implications. A mission may say it's good enough, and they may not be familiar with that in the security situation, cybersecurity in this context. Maybe we really don't want to do something for other reasons. So it is a trade-off, but you have to write it down so people can kind of understand. For that piece, though, it takes time, it takes lawyers, oversight and compliance, your chain of command, to actually sign off and be responsible for that. While we all think we know the rules, we all take our yearly training, it is always a challenge to make sure you understand what's going on. So a minute about explicit behavior. Again, different people call it different things. We're pretty good today, as the green highlights, being very explicit about the risk environments we're expecting, at least for our environment. We have context for why the person is trying to do something. We know the authentication methods. We know our authorization methods. But we probably want to start bringing in more information. The internet, Google and other commercial entities, they use device information. They use some environmental factors, especially like for the DVDs where you go across boundaries and you can't operate it on those DVD players because you're in the wrong region until you adjust the software to make it where you can. And we need to worry about what are our expected behaviors. Some of the banks and people like that do that, obviously, but we need to do that as a community, and we have to understand what we expect on our mission networks or our flyaway networks. But that leads into what is behavior? From the past, the present, what we think is the future, and then, again, if we can get someone to decide what is allowable. And to do that, we know we're going to need additional capabilities such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, of course. But we need to understand those models. I, for one, do not trust computers. I know people who program them, like me, and it scares the living daylights out of me that I want computers to do more and more when we don't actually understand how they come to conclusions. It's just like the self-driving cars. Those first-generation people who thought they were going to be done by 2020 and get rid of all the human drivers, they didn't understand some of the subtleties of that driving that humans adapt for, because you cannot program it or other such situations. But again, mission tolerance will come into place, and we have to understand our scope of mission tolerance, because when we're under certain stress, we may not accept certain things compared to others. So this one, I just want to ask right quick, I wish my Australians I saw earlier were here because they are always a great example. How many people, and most of y'all work for the government, obviously, or government contractors and stuff. When you have a document marked FOUO, and you were sitting in Indo-PACOM spaces, and there is a non-U.S. person who's fully cleared and approved to be in that location, can you give them that hard copy document? I need a show of hands for yes. Who think you can give it to them? Who think you can't give it to them? Well, it depends, unfortunately. In the intelligence community, after many years of having disagreements between certain agencies, OD&I said, when you mark something FOUO and that person's in the building and they're doing a related activity, there's an implied REL 2 5 eyes on that document. Again, it was implied. Oh my God, that really confuses people. Computers hate that. We hate that, but we take our training, so we know that. But it depends on who you talk to and the agency's cultures. It may be different. So some of us keep saying, if I'm generating that document, I actually hit save FOUO/REL 2 5 eyes because I want to be explicit about it. Moving to the right, you may have a document, again, marked FOUO with an agency logo on it. Your culture may dictate a deviation from what I just described. Computers don't know how to handle deviations like that, so it's something to think about. If your culture is you've never been part of a federation and you're part of a federation today and that person knocks on that web server, are you going to give it to them or not? Because you said, no, that should only be for people from my organization because the logo's on it. That is a challenge. Same goes with when you get commercial licensed material from like a geospatial information or other type of licensed material. Still might be considered FOUO or something like that. Sometimes the licenses say you can only have, so many concurrent users. That doesn't come across from that tag, so you got to understand what additional information is associated with that. Or one of my personal favorites, it's a FOUO no contractor, but we all know at most of the program management offices, you have contractors in there helping. They've signed NDAs. How do I know that from the tags that I have to make an access control decision? Then, of course, you can do ORCON and other such things too. But it's just a simple little thing to remind people. Tags are important. You need to tag them, but understand what your tags mean. So this is a quick example of that. On the left-hand side is a U.S. managed environment. You have first-party people from U.S., the primary agency, secondary agencies are supporting it. They're still U.S. people. You have integrees from partners. I'm using Five Eyes as an example. But they can't see certain documents if it's marked U.S. no foreign or U.S. only, etc. On the right-hand side, if I'm dealing with my Australian counterparts, they call themselves first party. But from us, they're a second party. But would never tell them that they're first party because they're a peer. But if I'm deployed down there, I'm a second party integree down there. If I go from their network to my system and my attributes for my nationality says USA, I should not be receiving US only documents. So you have to remember some of those subtleties that come into play. So you can't always just rely on REL 2. You have to rely on REL 2, additional attributes, and things like that. Because when I'm an integree down there, they gave me a desktop account, they gave me badges, they gave me credentials. I'm supporting their mission. There's multiple attributes. I won't go into this in great detail. There's enterprise attributes that everybody across the Federation should agree to and understand. You may have bilats or less than all lats going on where between me and that agency, I know I'm sharing additional attributes about an entity. And then there's always the local attributes. I always use time court approvers as that. That's local to you. You're not going to federate that information out. How you do that within your organizations is important. But if you're dealing with a similar type of organization, you might want to say, hey, because they may have the same application, you may call it the same attribute name and manage it differently, but it's the same. An example is that is when using Office 365 or something to that effect. Ian talked about this in his slide deck. So one thing that we want to move to, which is going to take us a few more years, is the challenge with digital rights management at the application layer. I don't want to be stovepiped into a Windows domain or something like that because we're federated. But I have to understand where my control is. I don't want to do DRM to everything, and this picture is just attempting to show I may do DRM within my environment by the yellow circles, but if I give a document to a partner, I still have to maybe make that access control decision. So they have to reach back to me to give it. The free is just saying it's non-DRM. If you have that, you have to remember that. That's where we kind of want to go with certain information, so we have additional control over it, assuming your agreements will work for that. Went back to, I don't have that slide. So the one challenge with application layer DRM now, for those who might have been around a while, it's where it's very vendor-centric. You have to be that specific product, and you may not want to force your partners to buy it, or they may tell you no. It's where email was about 25 years ago. You had to be on that specific vendor's email client and post office in order to send to other people and receive. We got to get beyond that, and we as a community have to work with the standards bodies and encourage the vendors to migrate. The other one is about location. Everybody says I'll use location to make an access control decision. Location is not the thing that is important. It's what is that location approved for? At times, I don't care where you are. If you're on the network and you reach me, I'm going to give you access. Other times, it increases. I need to know more about your location. I could use an IP address range. I may want to know CONUS or OCONUS. Or I really need to know you're sitting in that specific table in that specific chair, to taking it to an extreme. But anywhere else in this room, I couldn't let you have access. But physical location doesn't tell me anything. It's just a lat long, so to speak. What I need, and this is just a word I use to help to discuss it with some other people, is I need the user's location and their approval to operate at that location. And you always have a location determination. When you when you show up, you're in state 0. You're somewhere, okay? I'm not logged in. I'm not doing anything. But I still may need to know you exist, and I may give you additional attributes, assuming you exist within a U.S. government space or some other space. I give you attributes because all of a sudden I know something about you. After you log into, I jumped ahead. So once I know about you, I may give you additional things, assuming you're going to be doing certain environments. As an example, if you're the director of the organization, you probably have a lot more privileges and attributes than I do, because you're the director. So they may get additional information to it. And I need that location information to make those associations. But at runtime, that's a different location. I actually need to know where you're physically are. How we determine that is a challenge. It's simple. Everybody says, I'll use GPS. I normally don't have this thing with me ever. Or if I'm sitting in a submarine or other disconnected or low bandwidth environment, it probably is suboptimal to assume that. Or in times of stress, the GPS system will be down. So we have to figure out what we're going to do. But that state is different than when I'm just sitting around. So when you log off at the end of the day, to me, you go back to a 0 state because you're not doing anything online. So, a couple minutes fast. So I know it was really quick. I do want to bring up something Ian mentioned in his. As we have been adopting new capabilities to support in other environments, we know PKIs for users is not everywhere. People want YubiKeys, they want RSA tokens, they want phones, they want something else, not user ID and password, so we're pretty good about that. But and we want to adopt Office 365 and other things that are moving off of SAML to OAuth and OpenID Connect. For people who know about standards and read the standards, every standard is very flexible, and sometimes they're suboptimal from that perspective, especially for federation interactions. So under NSA's guidance, we have been working with the community, with the department, NIST, the standards bodies, and some of the vendors now to tailor OAuth and OIDC to work initially from me to my local systems, but with the focus being me to my federation partners, and pick specific use cases that the internet may not use because we are not the internet. We have our own enterprises, we have our own challenges. We may and for areas that are into specification, we say, turn this on, turn that off. We know we may need to improve in certain other areas, and we'll go past that. So those profiles have been briefed at Colonel Clancy's every other Friday meetings for Icam. They were briefed at FedID. They've been briefed a lot of places. But if you have questions about them, you can always just drop me a note, because we know we're not perfect, and we're always asking for comments and feedback. But summarize, it goes back to when we talk about federation, what are we trying to do in it? Am I just trying to send them a note every 10 hours, I send them a note, or they hip join with us doing collect about cyber things we're seeing, and we're both sharing sensors and processing that data. On the other extreme, how much are we integrated affects your problem? It's a persona, it's not your identity, because as a carbon life form, I have a certain identity, but when I log into my network, I could log in as an Alice, as an example. As long as people know that, so just kind of, it is a subtlety, but some of us are trying to remind people of that. Your identifier needs to be unique. Even if you never go across your federation, you need to be unique. In case you do, your applications have to be able to process on demand those unanticipated users who show up. Of course, and this is one that will get me in trouble at the office. Yes, smart tagging is important, but it won't solve all problems. Neither will zero trust. Applications are still stupid in that they are assuming that I'm only going to have this type of data, only this type of user. We have data that is commingled nowadays. I've got PII records, I got medical records, all of this stuff that goes in there, and they need to make sure they protect that information and not just let anybody who can reach it to get it. Location is a range of an approved state, and it's going to be a continuous journey for us. We know we'll never stop, as Ian has said earlier. And I think we're done working out. We'll do questions and stuff. He gets more questions than I do, just remember that. Any questions? Well, we do want to thank y'all for showing up. We know we're the last session of the day, too, so we do appreciate it. Oh, okay. Huh? We're Bravo Zulu.
Well, thank you, everybody, for sticking around, and thank you to our speakers here. Appreciate your time. In appreciation of your being here today, AFCEA will make a presentation to the Toys for Tots Foundation in your name. Thank you so much. As a reminder, This session is approved for some CE credits for cybersecurity certification. So if you'd like to receive attendance documentation, you can have your badge scanned in the back of the room as you go. This is our last session for today. We'll reconvene here in this space tomorrow at 8:30 for one more workshop on multi-domain federated identity and virtualization service. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.